Welcome to Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio coverage of 18NTC. You know what that is. It's the 2018 Nonprofit Technology Conference. We're coming to you from New Orleans at the Convention Center. And this interview is sponsored by Network for Good, easy-to-use donor management and fundraising software for nonprofits. My guests are Farra Trompeter, Taylor Leake, and Zhanna Veyts. Farra, closest to me, is Vice President of Big Duck, and she's also Chair of the Board of the Nonprofit Technology Network. Taylor Leake is Digital Engagement Director at Corporate Accountability, and Zhanna Veyts is Director of Digital Strategy and Engagement at HIAS. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you all.
Thanks,
my
Tony.
pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for taking time. I know, because I know the bar is open. But has anyone bought a drink?
Not yet.
Before
We're waiting for you to buy us drinks.
Oh, you are. You're going to hold your breath a long time. You're going to be blue in the face. Your seminar topic is Courageous or Cautious, Establishing Your Nonprofit's Brand Personality. Farra, I don't know how many different ways you can carve up brand personality. You and I have been talking about this for about 6 years, I think.
Maybe
on
maybe
Nonprofit
10.
Radio. I don't know. Multiple times on Nonprofit Radio, and here in the studio. Why is the brand personality so damn important?
Tony. Well, the concept of brand personality is one of two parts of brand strategy. The other part is positioning. And at Big Duck, we wrote a book many years ago. You've had Sarah on the show. Sarah Durham, our CEO, wrote a book called Brand Raising. And at the heart of brand raising, we look at brand strategy of positioning and personality as really being the essential ingredients to guiding your brand identity and the experience of your brand. And we really believe personality, especially, is a concept that is really easy to hone in on and then use to make decisions, from big things like your brand to day-to-day decisions like what should I post on Facebook and how should I say it.
Okay. And Taylor, brand personality takes on things like that are kind of esoteric, like tone.
Sure.
Right? And let's flesh this out a little bit. It's a person. I mean, it gets to tone and whether we're humorous or serious and things like that, right?
Right, absolutely, yeah. And we at Corporate Accountability a couple of years ago started working with Big Duck to do a whole organizational identity campaign. And one of the first things we did was take a look at what our personality was. So we went through a process with our staff, our board, our members, some of the folks who were most engaged, to really figure out sort of what was resonating, what wasn't, what work we were doing, and how all of that fit in. And what we came up with was a personality with 4 words. So it's smart, optimistic, fierce, and genuine. And we used that as sort of our North Star, our guiding light for everything that we did after that, which included coming up with a whole new name for the organization. And a whole new website. So it really was sort of the starting point for this really big, long process that has been really phenomenal and paid really nice dividends in the end.
It's soft G, right? Soft G. Soft, optimistic. What else?
Smart, not soft.
Smart, optimistic.
Genuine and fierce.
Oh, GF. Okay, it doesn't work. Okay,
Don't make an acronym out of it. Come on.
All right. Zhanna, down the end. What is you're also working with Big Duck at HIAS? Yeah.
We worked with Big Duck about 5 years ago. Yeah.
Okay. What did you discover in this in the brand personality process?
Well, we had to do a 360 as well, and it was a very intensive and quite long process. And what we learned was that our brand was seen very differently outside than the way that people saw it inside the organization. It was a 130-year-old organization, and people thought of it as your grandmother's HIAS, an organization that brought your grandparents over from the Holocaust or brought Soviet Jews over in the early 90s, late 80s, which it had, and I was actually a refugee brought over by HIAS. But we were still around, and now we were working in 20 states across the country, in 10 countries across the globe, in Washington doing fierce advocacy, and we wanted to communicate that. And so we couldn't be the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, an organization that sounds like at least 2 of those words are outdated. Instead, we became HIAS. We got a tagline, welcome the stranger, protect the refugee, so that it would be in lockup and always tell people that HIAS was the Jewish Refugee Protection Agency. And we got some brand personality words.
Okay, so there's a lot of introspection in this.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you had to admit that people thought you were dead. You had to hear that people thought you were either dead or irrelevant. I mean, that's hard to hear, right? I mean, it would be difficult for me. But you ask hard questions. You have to be willing to hear the answers. Farra, am I right?
Yeah, I don't think there was ever a worry that HIAS was dead. I think it was just more like there was a group of people who understood its work based in the past. And there was a fear, I think, too, at a point, if we talk about what we're doing now, we might lose some of those people who only knew us in a certain way. I mean, often with branding projects, not just with HIAS, with almost every nonprofit organization we work with, there's that as we think about shifting our identity, how do we make new friends and keep the old? And when we're taking this really hard look at ourselves and we're trying to, we're never trying to remake an organization. We're just trying to bring out who you really are now and tap into the best of who you are and make sure your communications actually reflect that.
Okay. So you both have worked with Big Duck, but I don't want to ask all the questions of Farra, the expert.
No.
So let's see.
They are experts as well.
Okay. So one of you, identifying where you stand now, like what your personality is now, how do you do that process? How do you start that process? Go ahead, Taylor.
So we started a couple of years back, and really, as you were just saying, it really started with introspection. It really started with sitting down, figuring out exactly who we were, what work we did, and then what other folks who were closest to us thought. So,
how do you gauge that? How do you find that out?
So we did a lot of interviews with staff and board members, as well as some of our closest philanthropic partners, and then we did sort of a broader survey of a few more of our members. Came up with word clouds and data points, and really crunched through just sort of what folks thought of us. And a few of the things that we found was that folks really resonated with our mission, which is to challenge corporate abuse, challenge life-saving corporate abuse, but they didn't necessarily know who we were. One of the reasons was that we had developed a whole bunch of campaigns, and people knew our campaigns, so they knew Kick Big Tobacco Out, and they knew Take Back the Tap, and they knew these campaigns that we were doing, but they didn't know that we were the ones doing them. And then, we had also transitioned from our organization started in the 70s with the Nestle boycott around infant formula. So we started as this really scrappy grassroots organization that, is just a couple folks taking on this giant corporation.
Yeah.
And then when we took on more campaigns, we transitioned into Corporate Accountability International. We were doing a lot of work at the UN. So we had put out different view of us being sort of stuffy policy wonks who are at the UN and, taking on really important decisions with ambassadors.
Okay.
So a lot of the work we had to do is both to say, how do we marry those two things? Because they're both true. And how do we reflect that in what we look like to the world, which was not the case before we went through this process.
Now, Zhanna, as you're going through this process, there are going to be people who are reluctant to abandon whatever Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, even though Farra is saying you don't want to lose the past, but as you embrace the future. But there are still going to be people that are not going to go along with HIAS. It's the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or it's nothing. How do we just let those people go, or what do we do to try to bring them along? And some people will never, but what do we do to try anyway?
It's an interesting question to ask, but we've been at it for 5 years since the rebrand, and luckily and unluckily, a lot of things have happened in the world to really help us do that. We're in the midst of the largest refugee crisis the world has ever seen. And as a Jewish organization rooted in Jewish history and values, where the Jewish refugee experience is really central, I wouldn't say that we lost that many people, but boy, did we gain a lot. It's an experience that it's a crisis that is in the news every single day these days. When I started out, I'm not going to lie, on a content side, it was
Are we talking about the Syrian refugee crisis?
The global refugees. There are 65 million people displaced around the world. 22 plus million of them are refugees. And yes, over 5 million are Syrian refugees, but we're talking about
we're talking about the
entire world.
The whole world crisis.
And we're talking about refugees in this country and what's happening in the administration and what the administration is doing to turn off refugee admissions to this country.
Yeah.
And so the Jewish community has been empowered and mobilized to advocate for refugees, to stand with HIAS in a really powerful and profound way to say that this is not what our country is about, this is not what our people are about, this is not what we want to be. And HIAS has been able to, our brand personality words are agile, fearless, intelligent. It was just the right fit.
You only got 3 words.
Those are the top 3.
Those are the top 3.
Corporate account only got 4. You got screwed.
Now, they might have 5 or 6, actually. She's just talking about the top 3. I do want to clarify something earlier. You were asking about, like, what's your brand personality now? Ideally, you don't change your brand personality, right? That you should every year do what we call a brand checkup or a brand audit, and you should just say, okay, here's our positioning and personality. Here's how we've been communicating. Here's what's happening in the world or our world. Does this all still feel relevant? But your brand personality and your brand positioning, which are internal tools, are meant to guide the organization for several years. You don't change it every year. You might accentuate certain traits in some places more than others, but you're not rechanging your brand personality every year.
Yeah, no, okay. How do you assess these things like tone and attitude, which are part of personality, humor or not? I mean, how do you... Yeah, I don't know. You're shaking your head, so I hope you understand, because I can't articulate it any further. How do you assess these things, these amorphous personality attributes?
So how do you first define what they should be, or how do you assess if you're actually expressing them?
No, yeah, the latter. If you're actually expressing what, reaching where you want to be.
I mean, I think I'd be curious to hear from Zhanna and Taylor on this too. I think it's hard because a lot of this is very subjective.
Yeah.
Right? So I might, what I think is funny or witty, like I might think something's witty and you find it insulting or you find it hysterical.
Yeah.
Like we all have, different interpretations. What does it mean to be fierce? What does it mean to be life-saving? There are different ways we might express these ideas. So, I mean, often it's a matter of asking for a few people their opinion. Does this feel this way? And also just asking the people you're trying to engage, how do you see us? Right? The most important is that donor, that activist, that volunteer, that audience member we're trying to engage with our communications, because at the end of the day, communications and your brand as part of that is about building relationships and making connections. Personality is making it easy for maybe me see myself in you, but if you don't see it, then something's wrong. So even talking to the people you're trying to reach and ask them how they describe you or how you make them feel, that's the best way to assess it. Short of that, talking to your coworkers and say, does this feel X or Y, and getting their feedback. But I'm curious how you guys sort of think about using the brand personality in day-to-day ways and how you assess if you're living up to that.
Welcome to Farra Trompeter Nonprofit Radio.
We're not co-hosting?
Yeah, I'm not splitting my profits with you, if that's what you're asking. No, go ahead, of course.
Sorry, Tony. I'll try and be a better guest.
Don't be sorry.
I think what Farra said about it being something that is sort of already part of who you are really resonates. So I think we use it as sort of a guide, right? So we have those words in mind when we're drafting content, when we're posting on social media, and oftentimes it will be that we're emphasizing one over the other. You can't be all 4 of those things at all times. But I think, for me, it's really a thing to keep in mind as you're working on everything you put out day to day, as, a reflection of what we do. But I think to me, it feels like those just are sort of intrinsic to the organizing we do. That is sort of why the organization hired all of us, because we, as individuals who work there, represent that, and the work that comes out of us represents that too. So it's hard to really assess because it feels just like it's part of who we are, and that's what we're doing is sort of representing that in the world in the best possible way we can.
Do you have a concern that as staff turnover in the organization, that the learnings that you have won't convey over?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we have some really incredible staff who've been there for a long time, and we have some really strong sort of internal processes that keep things pretty consistent.
Okay, let's talk about those. Let's add that to the list of discussion items. The process, because I mean there is a fair amount of turnover.
Sure.
Now, okay, of course, Farra said you do an annual checkup, so that is going to reinforce for people who weren't there in the past. But we'll talk about some processes. Zhanna, did you want to respond to what Farra was talking about?
Sure. So I think I could talk about it in two parts. On the one hand, I think that our personality as a brand seeped into our personality as an organization. I'm not sure if that was truly intentional, but it was entirely necessary. And by that I mean now we are in the process of suing the U.S. government, our biggest funder, for posing such a threat to refugee resettlement, which is at the core of what we do and at the core of what this country really stands for. That's a lot more than brand colors or guidelines or a tagline. That's about being life-saving at the core. So I don't think that that's the kind of thing that requires, an annual refresh. That's just who we are. And then the other piece is about how you make people feel. And I think that advocacy is a huge part of what we do, and community engagement in our work is a huge part of what we do. And so we give people a lot of different ways to take action, and we try to be very responsive to events and report those events to our supporters so that they can take action, and that includes situation in this country as well as international issues affecting refugees. And so we empower our supporters to be a reflection of our brand personality as well, and I think that creates a really strong connection.
Okay, so you work in digital engagement strategy. How do you ensure that other teams in HIAS feel the same? I mean, communicate in the same way if they're outward facing, or even if they're not outward facing, but even if they're strictly an internal team department. How do you convey this personality outside your team, your engagement team? Or how do you make sure that they feel what you feel? Or maybe it's not it may not be your responsibility to do that, but how does the organization ensure that this
ways large and small.
pervades
so
all the
a lot of it is
teams?
personal connections with our community engagement team, who are the people that are out in synagogues and at other conferences and in the Jewish community, engaging people in our mission. So being in close communications with them and working on the campaigns that we do together with communications, with development, to display our brand properly in an outward-facing way. Internal communications, we have an intranet where we talk with the programs people and share our brand guidelines, and anytime I see a programs person talking to our partners and sending out materials that are not on brand because they might be new and I haven't had a chance to meet them, and they need to be looped into, what our communications do and should look like, then we have conversations. I've traveled to our offices to give lunch and learns on our branding, and to our field offices, communicated with our global directors to make sure that globally our brand is well represented, which is by no means tricky. But it just requires.
By no means easy, you mean?
By no means easy.
Yeah.
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 But it's an ongoing process, and yes, there's turnover and volunteers and new people to educate all the time. I think that when the personality is so closely aligned with the mission, the people that are joining the team, wherever they may be, are already sort of half indoctrinated, and then it's just a matter of giving them some templates and some tools, and opening up the lines of communication.
Excellent. Yeah, very well said. Because, Farra, we do have to make sure that this pervades the entire organization, and even internal. I had mentioned not only for the outward-facing teams.
Yeah, I mean, some organizations use brand personality in their hiring, right? So we want to be seen as A, B, and C. We need to make sure that everyone who works for us is naturally that way. Both Zhanna and Taylor have spoken about how making the switch to train everyone in the brand personality actually wasn't that hard, because what we did in the process is figure out who they were, and in essence, there's lots of things, lots of adjectives, ways we might describe people. What we want to do is hone in on those 3 to 6 that we want to amplify, right? That we really want to be most known for, we want to most resonate, but they're who we are. So we're turning up on the volume of something we already have.
All right.
So organizations can use that in hiring, in even shaping conversations. But yes, every single person, if an organization wants to be seen as friendly, but if I call them on the phone and the person who answers the phone sounds pissed off or drops me on the line, or it takes 20 minutes till someone live answers the phone, I'm never going to be seen as open and accessible if it takes me 20 minutes to get a person on the phone. You never want to go for a brand personality that, in essence, will never be who you are. And every single person who represents the organization, and that includes inside, needs to understand what it is.
Yeah. Okay. And your point is you're emphasizing
Exactly.
what already exists.
Exactly.
You're bringing it to the top and prioritizing.
Right.
What
Prioritizing is a good
what a lot
word.
of people probably already feel, but it's
Right.
not articulated.
Correct.
Now we're making it explicit.
And let's be intentional and start trying to
explicit,
do that more in
intentional.
everything that we're doing.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. So let's talk about some of these internal processes that can be valuable to make this pervade and be consistent across all our teams, et cetera.
So, I mean, some things we recommend are make it part of orientation. So every time a new staff person, comes in, someone like Zhanna trains them and goes through the brand guide, explains the brand strategy, shows how we use it. Just make that part of a standard thing as any other onboarding. Have regular presentations at staff meeting. Depending on an organization, some organizations have staff meetings once a week, some have them once a year, in whatever format the staff is getting together, or they might use Slack or HipChat or Stride, whatever it may be. These tools where organizations are communicating already, take those ongoing moments and figure out where to plug communications, including the brand, into that. And not just saying, this is our brand personality, but saying, this is our brand personality. We were debating 2 covers for our annual report. Which one do you think looks more like X or more like Y? And getting people to understand how they use their brand personality in real time, real ways.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else have examples of what you do internally? Taylor?
Well, I think one of the biggest parts of our organizational identity campaign was coming out of it, we not only had a new name, but a new website. So that's just one thing off the bat where that's sort of our most public-facing piece, and we worked really hard to make sure that our new website represented our brand and our brand personality. And then we have had for a long time a style guide, so it guides what words we use in communications, make sure we're being inclusive and not using violent language, things like that. Mm-hmm. And then we also developed a branding guide, so it's a written document that explains what our personality is, what our positioning is, and then how to use that. And it also has things like colors and those sorts of things that just make it more able to be consistent for everybody who's using it.
Yeah, Zhanna, you talked a lot about what you do. Anything more you want to add about what you're doing at HIAS? Or you gave us a whole ton. You're up. You're up. You drew a bio this time. All right, we still have like another 3 minutes or so left. Implementing one of the things you mentioned in your session description, implementing your personality throughout your communications. I mean, it really pervades a lot of what we've already talked about. Anything more you want to make? Anything you want to make explicit about about the communications, Farra?
I mean, I would just say, don't just think about the big. So your website is hugely important. Your Facebook page, your annual report, your newsletter, all of these things that we immediately think of as communication tools are very important to represent us. But don't discount the things like the person who answers the phone or answers the email or the conference you're at, and you meet Taylor, who works for Corporate Accountability. You have a great experience with Taylor, of course, and Taylor represents certain feelings. You're going to cement in your brain and help see corporate accountability that way. You need to realize that your brand is emphasized across every single touch point. I know touch point's kind of a jargony word.
And throughout every person.
Every interaction, every person, even if you don't represent the organization on social media, it says you work there. People think about you that way. So your staff and your board are extensions of your brand, as well as every single person, your donors, your volunteers. The more they understand what you're about and are trained, as well as taught about how to represent you, the better you are in actually being seen that way you hope to be seen.
Yeah, volunteers is an interesting one too.
Yeah. And you guys did some volunteer organizational ambassador work. That might be interesting to talk about.
Yeah. The sort of most immediate iteration is right after the Trump election, we started the Corporate Accountability Action League. So this is a group of really dedicated volunteers who just raised their hand and said, this is unacceptable. The president is now a person who is cementing corporate power at the federal level, and I need to do something about that. So we now have a network of a couple thousand folks who are really engaged with our work, do some really high-level organizing around very specific issues that we sort of point them towards and let them go and make some impact. And yeah, I think, it was self-selecting at first, but then we've done a lot of work around sort of developing organizing guides that gives them the templates of how to run a campaign.
All the tools to empower them.
Exactly.
To take it within certain constraints.
Yeah, exactly.
To take it where they want to go.
Yep, and then we've done some digital work around webinars to sort of give them all of the facts that they need around an issue and explain why it's important and set them on the path to organizing around it.
We're going to leave it there. All right?
All right.
They are Farra Trompeter, Vice President of Big Duck and Chair of the N10 Board. Taylor Leake, Digital Engagement Director at Corporate Accountability. And Zhanna Veyts, Director of Digital Strategy and Engagement at HIAS. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Tony.
you.
Thank you, Tony.
You're very welcome. This interview is sponsored by Network for Good, easy-to-use donor management and fundraising software for nonprofits. And thank you for being with Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio coverage of 18 NTC.